right from the outset, what is going on in this passage? What's special? What's significant? What's unique? Well, here Jesus is commissioning his 12 apostles, enduing them with his authority and even with a measure of his own power, and then sending them out on mission into the world.
You're listening to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths, and today we begin a message entitled The Kingdom Advancing. And Jonathan, it's, I think, easy for some of us to fall into the temptation or the line of thinking that says something like, well, that was Jesus sending the apostles out. Of course, they were able to save souls. They were able to bring people into the kingdom. I mean, Jesus himself sent them out. How is that challenge relevant for me today?
I think it's very important for us to consider what Jesus was doing at that very early stage of his kind of world mission for his church. He was building a foundation for what would come later. And we really stand on the shoulders of the apostles. They went out as authoritative agents with Jesus' authoritative message and with the power of his Spirit. And of course, we don't take the place of the apostles, but we do carry out the apostolic mission in terms of bringing the apostolic word to the world in the power of the very same Spirit. So in the goodness of God, we continue the work that they began.
All right, apostolic mission, apostolic word. For many listening today, they're going to say, what does apostolic even mean? What is that mission? What is that word?
Yeah. Well, the apostles were the foundational leaders of the church that Jesus set apart to set down his message. The apostles were involved in the writing of the New Testament for us and clarifying what it meant to live as followers of Jesus in the world. And we are gifted with the writings that they left for us. But we aren't gifted with those things just to put them on a bookshelf. We're gifted with those so that they will shape our lives, and we'll go then and share the good news of the gospel with others. And so in that way, we continue the mission of the apostles.
Well, we're going to look at that today from the book of Matthew, chapter 10, looking at the first 17 verses as we begin The Kingdom Advancing. Here is Jonathan.
One of the easiest mistakes we make when studying the Bible is to jump straight from the text to ourselves, imagining somehow that every text and every story is somehow in some way about us, somehow applies directly to us. I think that's a very common assumption to make. So we read about David slaying Goliath in the Old Testament, and we think, where is my giant to slay this week? We read about Moses parting the Red Sea, and we think, I'd love to try that one out someday. We read of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, and we might think, where is the nearest morgue? Where do I begin? Those are extreme examples, maybe a bit silly, but you get the point. Often our instinct is to go straight from text to me. But very often, if we're going to be disciplined in our study of the Scriptures, we do need to just slow ourselves down a little bit. Now, the Bible is always relevant. It is God's living word, and it is his word to us. There's no question about that. There's no question that there is a life-giving message from God for each of us on every page. But sometimes the journey from the words on the page and the people in the action in the storyline, the journey from them in their situation to us in ours, it's not always direct. Now, I mention that because here in Matthew chapter 10, we find rich and powerful lessons for us about the mission of the church and the work of evangelism. But at the same time, we do need to slow down in our excitement and recognize that we are here in Matthew 10 looking at a unique situation and a unique context. And we are looking at people who, in some significant respects, are set apart from us. Matthew chapter 10 actually represents a turning point in the history of salvation and the story of the church. And before we apply its lessons to ourselves personally, we do need to understand the wider significance and the wider implications of what's going on here. Now, I mention all that right at the outset because this caution is relevant not only to this text in Matthew 10, but actually to all our reading of the Bible. We do need to be careful in jumping straight from text to me. And if we can gain a bit of discernment around that this morning, that's going to be a help to all of us in all our reading of Scripture. Okay, with that little caution in the back of our minds, let me just read again the opening verses of our passage. And let me ask you to consider, just as I read, what is special and what is unique about this passage and its context. He called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. I wonder if you caught it. Right from the outset, what is going on in this passage? What's special? What's significant? What's unique? Well, here Jesus is commissioning his 12 apostles, enduing them with his authority and even with a measure of his own power, and then sending them out on mission into the world. You see, before this text is about me or is about you, it is about the apostles of Jesus Christ. It is about the 12. And remember who they are. Remember why they're important. The apostles were Jesus's selected and designated, his special agents for building and for teaching the church. Ultimately, the apostles would be responsible for overseeing the production of the New Testament scriptures that we have in our hands today. You see, the true Christian faith is the apostolic faith. The true gospel is the apostolic gospel. The true church of Jesus Christ is built on the foundation of the apostolic ministry and the apostolic word. Now, there are going to be lessons here for us about our discipleship and our walk with the Lord. But in the first instance, the lessons here are about the apostles and their historically significant and their unique mission. And so to be faithful with the text and to be disciplined with the text this morning, we're going to take each point that we learn and begin by asking what we learn about the apostles and their mission. And only once we're clear on that will we move on to the application for us today. So we're going to intentionally slow ourselves down just a little bit. 4 lessons about the apostolic mission at this key turning point in the history of salvation and the history of the church. First, the apostolic mission shows us God's faithfulness to Israel. The apostolic mission, it shows us God's faithfulness to Israel. Most families have a room in their house or a place in their basement or their garage where the kids' discarded toys go. You know, the ones that they've grown out of or the ones they've got bored of. Sometimes toys that end up there, they're well and truly used and worn out. They've been loved and they've been played with for many years, but eventually they have reached the end of the road. We're not quite willing to throw them out, but they're sort of done with. But all too often, actually, a shiny new toy is exciting for a few days or a few weeks or a few months, and then it's kind of tossed aside and the child is on to the next new thing. You may have heard that the toy giant Toys R Us has gone bankrupt down in the United States anyway. I think the Canadian branch is carrying on. But while that bankruptcy was unfolding, I read a piece in the news about the founder of the chain who actually died while the bankruptcy was taking place. He had commented some years ago what a wonderful business the toy business was. It's a great business, he said, because toys don't last very long. And kids are always replacing them. You know that once they're out the door, they'll be back soon enough for the next new thing. Now, if we're not careful in our reading of the scripture, and if we don't work hard to see how God's plan of salvation carries on from Genesis to Revelation, we could make the mistake of thinking that when we cross over from Old Testament to New Testament, God has forgotten all about his Old Testament people, Israel. He was focused on them in earlier generations, and he made great promises to them. But now in the New Testament, he's kind of moved on and forgotten about them. The nation and the people, they've been cast aside as the Lord's interest has shifted to new things. Now, it's easy enough to fall into that kind of assumption, but a careful reading of the New Testament, it doesn't take us there. And the apostolic commission here in Matthew chapter 10, it guards us against it. I don't know if you take an interest in numbers in the Bible. Sometimes we can get a bit carried away with the numbers and the possible symbolism and so on of it. We shouldn't get carried away, but I think it is fair to say that the number 12 is pretty significant. It was very famously the number of the 12 sons of Jacob and the number of the tribes of Israel. The nation was a nation of 12 parts, 12 groups, 12 tribes. And so when Jesus sets apart a group of key representatives to lead his mission, to act as his agents, to establish his church, to build his kingdom, it is no accident that he sets upon the number 12. Now, with that in mind, we look down then to the instruction Jesus gives in verse 5. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. You may remember from last week in the previous chapter that Jesus shared his heart of compassion for the broken society that he saw before him. He looked out on the crowds in verse 36 of chapter 9, and he had compassion on them, we read, because they were as sheep without a shepherd, harassed and helpless. We've seen the heart of compassion of Jesus Christ. But now he wants us to know that the first group that he has on his heart, the first object of his concern, is the people of Israel. They're the first lost sheep that he wants to gather. You see, he hasn't forgotten his covenant love for them, his covenant promises to them.
You're listening to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths and a message called The Kingdom Advancing, part of our series, Kingdoms Colliding. We're glad you've tuned in to this program today. I want to let you know, as we have just a couple days left in this month, that there are 2 more days to give a gift of support and request a copy of the book, The Names of Jesus, Experiencing the Blessing of Knowing Him. This book is written by Warren Wiersbe, and it explores 14 names of Jesus from both the Old and New Testaments, explaining their meaning as well as their relevance to believers today. Some of the names include the Nazarene, the Pioneer, the Carpenter, and the Alpha and the Omega, just to name a few. Again, this book is our thank you gift to you as you financially support Encounter the Truth this month. You can give your gift online at encounterthetruth.org or call us at 833-99-TRUTH. That's 1-833-998-7884 or encounterthetruth.org. Let's get back to the message. Here is Jonathan.
In our age, when equality and fairness are viewed as the highest virtues in public life, it strikes us as odd that Jesus would place this priority on a particular people or a particular group. Surely he can't be treating any one group any differently from the way he treats everyone. But we must remember the promises of God to his people through the Old Testament. We must remember his gracious favor to this particular nation through their history. And we must remember that Jesus came, first of all, as the Messiah of Israel. The scope of God's plans were never limited to Israel, of course. His ultimate focus was never a particular and single nation or a particular piece of real estate in the Middle East. If we think back to Genesis chapter 12 and the foundational promise of God to Abram, the father of the Jewish nation, we recall that God had promised to bless him and bless his family in this singular and wonderful way, but he did so in order that blessing might overflow to the world. In you will all the nations be blessed, God said. Now, we've seen hints of this wider blessing already in Matthew, where Jesus has ministered to the Gentiles, and we'll see more of that. And if we think forward to the end of Matthew's gospel, you may remember how it ends. It ends with the Great Commission for the apostles and for the whole church. It widens to include a vision for salvation to the world. Remember the Great Commission. Remember how the gospel ends. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. It's a worldwide vision, a worldwide mission. Blessing will come to the world through the gospel, but God's plan begins with Israel. And Jesus came first and foremost to bring salvation to Israel. And so when he sets apart his apostles, he appoints 12 of them, reminding us of the 12 tribes, 10 of which have been lost by now. And he says, go and seek out the lost sheep from this nation, this family, who are so heavy on my heart. Now, what does that tell us? What's the significance of that for us now? Well, it tells us that God is a God of faithfulness. It tells us that God is a God who keeps his promises and carries through on his commitments. He never forgot his people of old. He never abandoned them. They would need to accept his Messiah and recognize their true king. That's essential. That's not going to be bypassed. But he did come to save them. Now, whether we're Jews or Gentiles, that is very good for us to see and understand, isn't it? It's good because it tells us that our God is a trustworthy God, one who can be relied upon to do what he says he is going to do. It's significant also, I think, because it reminds us to keep on praying that Jewish friends would see the wonder of the gospel, would recognize Jesus, and find salvation in the Messiah. I know quite a number here in the church family have a particular heart to pray for Jewish people to find Christ and have a heart to bear witness to Jewish friends. And I think this reminder here at the beginning of Matthew 10 simply encourages us to pray and to witness, knowing the Lord's heart. I think this point also humbles us, those of us not from a Jewish background. It humbles us with the reminder that we were not first in line for salvation. The Apostle Paul speaks elsewhere of Gentiles being grafted into salvation, into the tree of God's family. And here we're just reminded again, if we're Gentiles, God has been abundantly gracious to us to include us in his plan of salvation. But the plan began with the nation of promise. The apostolic mission, it shows us God's faithfulness to Israel. Next, it carries with it the authority of Jesus. Jesus is very intentional here in the text in sending out the apostles with his own personal authority to say the things that he has been saying and to do the things that he has been doing. Notice again verse 1. He called his 12 to him, gave them authority to drive out evil spirits, to heal every disease and sickness. Verse 7, as you go, preach this message. The kingdom of heaven is near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Does any of that sound familiar? I think it does, because it is precisely what Jesus has been doing thus far in Matthew's gospel. It is a complete parallel. They are to go and do what he does, saying what he says. Now, if we're reading this text with that instinct I spoke about earlier, that instinct to superimpose ourselves right on the text, our takeaway and our main application would be this. Like the apostles, we should go out with the authority of Jesus to drive out evil spirits, heal diseases, and raise the dead. That would be our takeaway and our application. But I don't think that's a disciplined reading of the text. The main point of the text here is that the apostles were commissioned to do this. And you and I need to know that the apostles had that commission. If you ever come into our church offices to visit one of the pastors or the ministry directors, you'll notice that many of the team have certificates up on the wall, seminary certificates, ordination certificates. I'm actually one of the very few on the team that hasn't got anything like that up on the wall. That may be a worrying sign when people come to visit me. Anyway, it's sometimes comforting, isn't it, to see that a person in leadership has their credentials available and even on display. It makes you feel good, doesn't it, when you go into the dentist's office and you see a wall of certificates that look pretty genuine. This person is certified. This person is qualified. He's not simply a guy with gloves and a drill and an unusual willingness to inflict agony. Now, what we've got here in our passage is the commissioning certificate for the apostles. The words of Jesus and the signs that the apostles will go on to perform, they prove their legitimacy as true agents of Christ, as true speakers of his word, as true teachers of doctrine, as leaders of the church. Just as in Jesus' own ministry, the miracles he performed were confirmation that he was truly God's agent, his son, his king. We've seen that already in Matthew's gospel, and we spent time on that. So now Jesus sends out his apostles to do the same things and to say the same things in order that the world will see that they are his true agents, speaking his true word. And actually, if you and I today are to have confidence in the apostolic scriptures, this is a very important thing for us to see and to understand. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 20, Paul says that the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In our neighborhood, there's a new retirement home being built. I think it's going to be a pretty big one, judging by the giant hole they've dug in our village. We've been watching the work progress a little bit over recent weeks. They've just laid the foundations, actually, and it's actually quite impressive to look at. It's become clear that this will be a really very big building. Huge concrete foundation going 2 or 3 stories deep into the ground. On one level, it's not a very exciting phase of the build. You're not seeing too much coming up into the air yet, but it's so vital for this to be done right, isn't it? If the foundation is good, the building is going to stand the test of time. And in a sense, here in Matthew chapter 10, we are having a good look at the foundations of the church of Jesus Christ. We are seeing what it is all built on, seeing that Jesus laid the foundation himself. And seeing that and knowing that, we're given confidence that the thing is solid. And so the lesson for us here, well, the lesson is not primarily that we are to go out and do all the things that the apostles did. The lesson here is that you and I need to have confidence in the apostolic message and the apostolic word. We should have confidence in the New Testament scriptures. It's worth remembering that Jesus himself did not sit down and write any of the New Testament. Ultimately, he gave that authority, that responsibility over to these apostles. He superintended it by his Spirit, of course. But the apostles did the work. And here in our passage, we're being told simply that these guys are legitimate. It's a big point. It's foundational stuff. We need to have confidence in the apostolic teaching and believe the apostolic word, because their mission, it carries the stamp of authority of Jesus Christ himself. That's a big takeaway. Next and third, the apostolic mission demonstrates God's great power in weakness. I think it's possible for us to put the apostles of Jesus Christ on pedestals and to carve their images in stone in cathedrals and name churches after them. That's been done down through the centuries, of course. And of course, these men were greatly used of God, and we do have cause to be thankful for them. But they weren't superhuman, far from it.
We're going to pause our message right there, but we'll get back to this message from Matthew chapter 10, the kingdom advancing, next time here on Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths. If you ever miss a broadcast or you want to go back and just listen to it again, you can do that by visiting our website, encounterthetruth.org. Well, as you give a gift of any amount and support Encounter the Truth this month, we want to say thank you by sending you a book that Jonathan has picked. It's called The Names of Jesus, written by Warren Wiersbe. And Jonathan, I think sometimes we may have people in our lives that we want to introduce to Jesus, and we may look for different and creative ways to do that. And I think this book is a tool that could be used to do just that.
Oh, I think it could. And I often find that I've got a book or a resource that I can hand to people where I sense maybe there's some interest, there's some openness, either to coming to know Jesus for the first time or to growing in him. I love to have something on hand that I can give away. And I think this little book, simple and attractive in its presentation, The Names of Jesus, will be just that kind of resource. And maybe you've got someone in your life, a neighbor or a grandchild or a colleague at work, and you think, if I had something available, I could just hand it on and then prayerfully see how the Lord might use it. I think this could be just such a resource.
Well, we'd love to send you a copy that you can read for yourself or to give away, or why not do both? You can contact us here at Encounter the Truth call us at 833-99-TRUTH. That's 1-833-998-7884. And our website is encounterthetruth.org. For Jonathan Griffiths and our producer Mark Bretta, I'm Steve Hiller. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us next time.